three branches of government. In this lesson, we're going to look at the three branches of government that we talked about in the first lesson about the big ideas. This lesson is just going to kind of break them down a little bit more to kind of figure out who is in each branch of the government and what they can do, what their powers are. And then we'll also look at ways that they can kind of check up on each other. So a lot of it's going to sound pretty familiar from the last lesson. We're just going to kind of expand on that knowledge that you gained from the last lesson. So remember, the three branches are how the government is split up. Our objectives are the things you'll be able to do. You'll be able to examine separation of powers and checks and balances and evaluate the importance of these principles. And our essential questions are the things you'd be able to answer. How is power separated in U.S. government? And how do we ensure or make sure power is balanced? So here's separation of powers. Remember, that's one of our big ideas for the pod. Those things are going to pop up quite often throughout the whole pod. Remember, separation of powers just means that the power is split up. The Constitution makes it so there's not just one group that has all the power. There's three groups that have power: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Each branch is responsible for their job. No one gets too much power and makes things run smoothly. It's kind of like splitting up the work. Instead of one person having to do all the work, it'd be a lot better if there was three people. So they split it up to make things run a little bit more smoothly and make sure that there's not one group that has too much power. So what does each one do? It starts with the legislative branch. That's Congress. They're the ones that make laws. They're the ones that come up with ideas for laws, discuss them, and decide if it's something that should be a law, if it's a good law. That's what the legislative branch does for the most part. The executive branch, which is the president, gets to carry out the laws or make sure that people are following the laws and making sure that people have a way to do whatever is in the law. Like, for example, they're like welfare, for example, or government assistance, like getting a check each month. The executive branch makes sure that that happens. Like if you have to go to like the Social Security Administration or some kind of government building to get it, that's technically part of the executive branch because they're carrying out the law. The law was that there's supposed to be government assistance. That was made by the legislative branch. The executive branch is carrying out that law or making sure there's a way to get that government assistance. That's an example of what the executive branch does. Then you have the judicial branch, which is a bunch of courts, and they look at those laws and they decide if they're good or not. They decide if they go against the Constitution or if they don't go against the Constitution. And they usually hear court cases about those laws. Let's go to the next one. So let's look at each branch and what they do a little more closely. The first branch is the legislative branch. Remember we said that's Congress. And Congress is split up into two groups as well. So again, we're splitting up power even more. We don't just have the three branches. Even the branches are split up into groups as well to really spread out the power. Congress is split up into the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we get to pick the people that are in both of those. And their main thing is they make laws. Next branch is the president, the most famous one, the executive branch. They carry out the laws. The executive branch is made up of the president, and then the president has a vice president and a cabinet, which is like a kind of a group of advisors that help the president decide what the president should and should not do. Like there's a president or a cabinet member that's in charge of just education. There's a cabinet member that's in charge of how to defend the country. There's a cabinet member that's in charge of dealing with other countries and just talking to them. So the president has those advisors that kind of help him or her make the decisions that they need to make for the country, and they also have a vice president. And remember, the executive branch is anything or any part of the government that helps make sure that laws are getting carried out. Not just that we're following the laws, but that if there's a law that helps us, we have a way to make sure that we can have access to whatever that law is providing us. Remember, we used government assistance as an example. The last one's the judicial branch. They're kind of like the final say on things. They evaluate laws. So, and that's split up into a bunch of different courts. The Supreme Court, circuit courts, and district courts. There's just one's higher than the other. So what do? They look at laws and they decide if they're good or not. So they hear court cases and they decide if a law has been violated or not violated. And most of those cases involve something that has to do with the Constitution. So if the legislative branch makes a law and the executive branch decides that it should be a law, the judicial branch might later, like a few months or years down the line, they might hear a court case about that law where they get to decide if that law gets to stay or not. So here's just all of them together, just so you can look at it real quick and kind of review. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. That's, again, to separate the power and make it so there's not just one group that has all the power. And then those groups are even split up even more. The legislative branch has Congress, which is split up into the House and the Senate. The executive branch is split up into the president, the vice president, and the cabinet members. And the judicial branch is split up into all the different courts, with the Supreme Court being the top one. On top of all that, on top of all this power being split up and having all of these people that have different amounts of power, remember that the branches can do things to each other. There's things they can do to make sure that the other branch isn't becoming too powerful. Like the executive branch, for example, the president gets to pick the judges that are going to be in the judicial branch. So you don't just get this job as a judge in the judicial branch. The president has to pick you. So then you might be saying to yourself, but then the president can just put all of his friends in the positions and just make it so the judges are all the president's friends. Well, a way to keep that from happening is the legislative branch has to look at those people, like their resumes, and talk to them and things like that, and they have to approve the people that the executive branch picked. So the executive branch gets to decide who's in the judicial branch, gets to pick the judges, but the legislative branch gets to vote on whether or not they should be judges to kind of keep everything in check. Here's another example of just checks and balances and how it works. I'll leave it up here for the rest of the presentation, just in case you needed to answer some of the questions. You can pause the screen at this point. As far as the rest of this week, make sure you're joining me in live class at 2 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm here to help you as needed. You just need to contact me. If you need help with this lesson, please let me know. If not, good luck.